Lieutenant Sarah Chen thought she knew everything about flying until she met the old mechanic in Hangar 7. Frank never spoke unless spoken to, never offered opinions about the planes he fixed, and certainly never acted like he knew better than the pilots. But when Sarah mentioned struggling with high-altitude stalls during training, Frank looked up from his wrench and said quietly, "Try dropping your left wing 2 degrees and cutting throttle by 15%. It was oddly specific advice from someone who supposedly had never left the ground. Welcome to Hidden Heroes. Before we begin this incredible story of hidden expertise and forgotten legends, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button. These are the heroes hiding in plain sight. Edwards Air Force Base sprawled across the Mojave Desert like a monument to human ambition, where the sound of jet engines was as constant as the desert wind. In Hangar 7, tucked between the flight line and the administrative buildings, Frank Morrison had worked for the past 12 years without fanfare or recognition. At 68, Frank moved with the deliberate precision of someone who'd learned that mistakes in aviation could be measured in lives rather than dollars. His gray hair was always covered by a faded baseball cap, his hands permanently stained with engine grease, and his face weathered by decades of desert sun and jet fuel fumes. The younger mechanics called him Silent Frank behind his back, not out of malice, but because he rarely spoke beyond the necessities of the job. He arrived at 6 a.m. sharp, checked his tool inventory with military precision, and spent his days elbow-deep in the guts of F-16s, F-22s, and occasionally the experimental aircraft that made Edwards famous. Frank knew every bolt, wire, and component of every plane that rolled through his hangar. When Lieutenant Sarah Chen's F-16 developed a hydraulic leak during her training rotation, it was Frank who diagnosed the problem in minutes, fixed it without drama, and had her back in the air before lunch. Most pilots barely acknowledged the ground crew, and Frank preferred it that way. He learned long ago that attention usually brought questions, and questions brought complications he'd spent over 2 decades trying to avoid. But Sarah Chen was different. She was 26, sharp as a blade, and possessed the kind of hunger for perfection that reminded Frank of someone he used to know. Sarah treated everyone on the base with respect, from the commanding officers to the mechanics, and she had a habit of asking detailed questions about aircraft performance that most pilots never bothered with. "How long have you been working on fighters?" she asked Frank one afternoon while he replaced a sensor array on her F-16. "Long enough," Frank replied without looking up from his work. "You seem to know these planes better than most people know their own cars." Frank tightened a connection and tested the circuit. "Planes don't lie. They tell you exactly what's wrong if you know how to listen." Sarah leaned against the workbench, genuinely curious. "Did you ever want to fly them?" For just a moment, Frank's hands stilled. Then he resumed his work, voice carefully neutral. "Some of us are meant to keep them in the air. Others are meant to fly them." It was the kind of non-answer that usually ended conversations. But Sarah persisted. "I'm having trouble with high-altitude stalls. The manual says one thing, but it doesn't feel right when I'm up there." Frank set down his wrench and looked at her directly for the first time in their conversation. Sarah saw something flicker in his weathered eyes, something that looked almost like recognition. "Try dropping your left wing 2 degrees and cutting throttle by 15%, he said quietly. "The manual assumes perfect conditions. Real flying happens in imperfect conditions." Sarah blinked. It was incredibly specific advice, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd dealt with high-altitude stalls personally. But Frank was a mechanic, ground crew. He wasn't supposed to know flying techniques with that level of precision. "Have you, dealt with that situation before?" she asked carefully. Frank had already turned back to his work. "Read it somewhere," he said, but his voice carried a weight that suggested otherwise. The next morning, Sarah took Frank's advice on her high-altitude training run. At 30,000 feet, when her F-16 began to shudder in the thin air, she dropped her left wing exactly 2 degrees and reduced throttle by 15%. The stall broke cleanly, and she regained control with a smoothness that surprised even her instructor. "Nice recovery, Chen," came the voice through her headset. "Where'd you learn that technique?" Sarah hesitated. "Just something I picked up." But her mind was racing. Frank's advice hadn't just worked, it had worked perfectly. It wasn't the kind of knowledge you got from reading manuals or watching videos. It was the kind of knowledge that came from experience, from being in that exact situation, and knowing what worked. After she landed, Sarah went straight to Hangar 7. Frank was working on an engine rebuild, his hands moving with the same precision she'd noticed before, but now she was watching differently. His movements weren't just efficient, they were— "Frank," she said, approaching his workstation, "that advice you gave me yesterday, it worked perfectly." Frank didn't look up from the engine. "Good. Too perfectly. That's not mechanic knowledge, is it?" This time Frank did pause, his hands stilling on the wrench. When he looked at Sarah, she saw something new in his expression, a wariness that hadn't been there before. "I've been around planes a long time," he said carefully. "How long?" Frank studied her for a long moment, as if weighing something in his mind. 43 years. All as a mechanic? The question hung in the air between them. Frank could have lied, could have deflected, could have told her to mind her own business. Instead, he seemed to make a decision. "No," he said quietly. "Not all as a mechanic." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "What else?" Frank set down his tools and turned to face her fully. For the first time since she'd known him, he looked every one of his 68 years. "You ever hear of the 64th Aggressor Squadron?" he asked. Sarah's breath caught. Every fighter pilot knew about the aggressor squadrons, the elite units that flew captured enemy aircraft and tactics to train American pilots. They were legendary, and the 64th had been among the most secretive. "You flew aggressors?" she asked, barely breathing. Frank nodded slowly. 26 years, started in 78, retired in 2004. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Frank wasn't just a mechanic who happened to know about flying, he was a pilot, an aggressor pilot. The kind of aviator who flew MiGs against American fighters, who knew enemy tactics better than the enemy did, who could outfly pilots half his age in aircraft he'd never seen before. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" she asked. Frank's smile was tired. "Because that life ended 20 years ago. This one is simpler." Word spread quietly through the pilot community at Edwards. Not gossip exactly, but the kind of information that moves between professionals who respect each other. By the end of the week, Sarah wasn't the only one who knew that Silent Frank in Hangar 7 had a past. Major Rebecca Torres, the squadron's operations officer, made a point of stopping by Frank's workstation on Friday afternoon. She didn't say much, just asked a few technical questions about her F-22's avionics, but she watched Frank's hands as he worked, noted the precision, the confidence. "Frank," she said as he finished the diagnostic, "mind if I ask you something?" Frank looked up, already knowing what was coming. "Shoot." "Sarah Chen mentioned you might have some flying background. Any truth to that?" Frank considered lying again, but he was tired of pretending. These pilots deserved honesty, especially if they were going to trust his mechanical work with their lives. "Some," he said simply. "What kind of some?" Frank wiped his hands on a rag, buying time. "Aggressor pilot, 64th Squadron, then later the 65th when they stood up the F-16 program." Major Torres blinked. She'd heard of the 64th, of course, but meeting an actual aggressor pilot was like meeting aviation royalty. These were the guys who'd trained an entire generation of American fighter pilots, who'd flown every enemy aircraft imaginable, who'd pushed the envelope so far that some of their tactics were still classified. "How many years?" she asked. 26 active flying, then another 6 as an instructor before I retired." "Jesus," Torres breathed. "Why are you fixing engines instead of teaching pilots?" Frank's expression darkened slightly. "Because teaching requires talking about things I'm not supposed to talk about. And because after 32 years of flying, sometimes you just want to keep your feet on the ground." Torres nodded, understanding more than Frank probably realized. Even training combat flying took a toll that civilians never saw. Sometimes the best pilots were the ones who walked away before the job broke them. "Would you," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "would you be willing to share some of that experience? Unofficially?" Frank looked at her for a long moment. "What did you have in mind?" It was Captain Jake Razor Williams who first saw the tattoo. Frank was reaching deep into an F-22's engine bay, trying to access a sensor that required him to stretch his arm past its normal range. His sleeve rode up, exposing his forearm, and Williams caught a glimpse of something that made him stop mid-conversation. Pilot wings. Not the standard air pilot wings that every aviator wore on their uniform, but something older, more distinctive. And below them, what looked like aircraft silhouettes, dates, and numbers that meant something to someone who knew how to read them. Williams didn't say anything at first. He'd heard the rumors about Frank's background, but Seeing actual ink was different. Tattoos didn't lie, and the ones on Frank's arm told a story that most pilots could only imagine. Later that afternoon, Williams approached Sarah. "Frank pretty well, right?" "I guess. Why?" "I saw his tattoo today. The pilot wings. There's more there than just basic aviator ink." Sarah felt a flutter of curiosity. "What kind of more?" "The kind that says he's done things most of us will never do." That evening, Sarah found herself lingering in Hangar 7 after most of the day shift had gone home. Frank was still there, as he usually was, working on a troublesome hydraulic system by himself. "Frank," she said, approaching his workstation, "can I ask you something personal?" Frank looked up, his expression guarded. "Depends how personal." "Captain Williams mentioned seeing a tattoo on your arm. He said it looked significant." Frank set down his tools and rolled up his sleeve deliberately, revealing the ink that he'd kept hidden for so long. Sarah moved closer, studying the intricate design that covered most of his forearm. At the top were pilot wings, but not standard issue. These were older, more detailed, and below them was something that made Sarah's breath catch. Aircraft silhouettes, lots of them. MiG-21s, MiG-23s, F-5 Tigers, F-16s, F-15s, and aircraft she didn't immediately recognize. "Each one represents a different aircraft type I was qualified to fly," Frank said quietly. "In the aggressor program, we didn't just fly American planes pretending to be Russians. We flew actual Russian planes." Sarah counted the silhouettes. 15 different aircraft types. That represented years of training, thousands of flight hours, and access to some of the most classified aircraft in American inventory. "This one," she pointed to a MiG silhouette with dates beneath it, 1987 to 1994. "That's 7 years flying enemy aircraft." Frank nodded. "Best 7 years of my life, and the worst." "Why the worst?" Frank rolled his sleeve back down, covering the tattoo. "Because when you spend that long learning to think like the enemy, sometimes you forget how to think like yourself." Major Torres found Frank the next morning working alone in the hangar before the day shift arrived. She'd been thinking about their conversation, about Frank's background, and about an opportunity that had just presented itself. "Frank, I need to ask you something, and I want you to hear me out before you say no." Frank looked up from the engine he was rebuilding. "I'm listening." "We've got a group of new pilots coming through next month, fresh out of training, confident as hell, and about to get their asses handed to them by reality. The standard orientation program is good, but it's predictable." Frank waited, sensing where this was heading. "I want you to talk to them, not about mechanics, about flying, about what it's really like when someone's trying to kill you at 30,000 feet. Frank was already shaking his head. "Torres, I'm not an instructor anymore. I fix engines. But you were. For 6 years, you trained pilots who went on to fly combat missions. Some of those pilots are probably still flying today because of what you taught them." Frank stopped working, his hands still on the wrench. Torres was right, and they both knew it. In his 6 years as an instructor after his flying career ended, Frank had trained hundreds of pilots, not just in tactics, but in the kind of practical wisdom that kept people alive when the manual didn't have an answer. "What would I tell them?" Frank asked quietly. "The truth. That flying fighters isn't about being the hottest pilot in the sky. It's about coming home alive. And sometimes that means making decisions that aren't in the book." Frank considered this. The young pilots he'd worked with over the past few years reminded him of himself at that age, overconfident and underprepared for the realities of aerial combat. Even in training, the margin for error was thin. "One session," he said finally. "Unofficial. No ranks, no protocol. Just pilots talking to pilots." Torres smiled. "That's exactly what I had in mind." The briefing room in Building 337 wasn't large, but it felt intimate in a way that the main auditorium couldn't match. 12 new pilots sat in folding chairs, chatting nervously among themselves as Major Torres made introductions. "Gentlemen and ladies, I want you to meet Frank Morrison. Frank's going to share some thoughts about tactical flying that you won't find in your textbooks." Frank stood at the front of the room in his work clothes, looking distinctly uncomfortable. These pilots were young, eager, and probably wondering why a mechanic was giving them a flying lesson. "How many of you have been in a real dogfight?" Frank asked without preamble. No hands went up. Frank nodded as if he'd expected this. "Good. Real dogfights aren't like the simulators. They're not like red flag exercises. They're chaos with physics attached, and the pilot who survives isn't necessarily the best stick. He's the one who makes the fewest mistakes. Frank moved to the whiteboard and began drawing aircraft positions, not from memory but from experience. November 15th, 1991. I'm flying a MiG-29 against an F-15 Eagle during a classified exercise. The Eagle pilot is better than I am, faster, with better situational awareness. By every metric, he should win. The room had gone completely quiet. These pilots had never heard someone casually mention flying a MiG-29, one of the Soviet Union's most advanced fighters. But the Eagle pilot makes one mistake, just one. He assumes I'll follow standard Soviet doctrine and try to engage at long range with missiles. Instead, I merge close and use the MiG's superior turning ability. The fight is over in 90 seconds. Frank turned back to the group. That Eagle pilot survived because it was an exercise. In a real fight, he'd be dead, not because he was a bad pilot, but because he made one assumption about how his enemy would behave. For the next hour, Frank shared stories that weren't in any official record. He talked about flying captured aircraft that most Americans had never seen, about learning enemy tactics so thoroughly that he could think like a Russian pilot, and about the psychological pressure of constantly playing the role of the bad guy. The hardest part of being an aggressor pilot, Frank said as the session wound down, isn't learning to fly different aircraft. It's learning to think differently, to abandon everything you were taught about honor and fair play and focus purely on survival. Lieutenant Chen raised her hand. How do you turn that off? When you're not playing the enemy anymore? Frank was quiet for a long moment. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you carry that mindset with you long after you stop flying. It's why a lot of aggressor pilots have trouble transitioning back to regular squadrons. Is that why you became a mechanic? Asked Captain Williams. Frank looked at him directly. I became a mechanic because after 32 years of trying to kill people and avoid being killed, I wanted to do something that helped people instead. Every plane I fix is a plane that's more likely to bring its pilot home safely. That matters more to me now than anything I did in the cockpit. Word of Frank's informal briefing spread through Edwards faster than a fuel leak. Within days, pilots were stopping by Hangar 7, not just for mechanical work, but for advice. Frank found himself answering questions about flying that he hadn't thought about in years. Frank, said Major Torres one afternoon, I've been getting calls. Other squadrons want to know if you'd be willing to do more briefings. Frank looked up from the F-16 engine he was servicing. I told you, one session. I know what you told me, but these pilots need what you're offering. Real knowledge from someone who's been there. Frank was quiet for a moment, his hands still working on the engine. Torres, I retired from flying for a reason. I didn't want to be responsible for training people to kill each other anymore. You're not training them to kill, you're training them to survive. There's a difference. Is there? Torres moved closer, her voice lower. Frank, in 2 months, half these pilots are going to deploy to combat zones. The knowledge you're sharing could save their lives. How is that not worth your time? Frank finished tightening a bolt and stepped back from the engine. Because every time I talk about those missions, every time I share those stories, I remember why I walked away. And I'm not sure I want to go back to being that person. Torres nodded, understanding more than Frank probably realized. What if I told you that Lieutenant Chen credits your advice with saving her life last week? Frank looked up sharply. What happened? Bird strike during a training mission. Lost most of her hydraulics. She used a technique you'd mentioned about unconventional control inputs. Brought the plane home in one piece. Frank felt something shift in his chest. He'd spent the last 12 years fixing planes, telling himself that was how he contributed to aviation safety. But hearing that his knowledge had directly saved a pilot's life reminded him why he'd become an instructor in the first place. One more session, he said finally. But I want to choose the topic. Deal. What topic? Frank's smile was grim. How to survive when everything goes wrong. 6 months later, Frank Morrison stood in front of a different briefing room, this one in the Pentagon. The audience was larger now, senior officers and experienced pilots from across the Air Force. His presentation had evolved from informal hangar talks to something resembling an official curriculum. Situational awareness, Frank was saying, isn't just about knowing where the enemy is. It's about knowing where he's going to be and being somewhere else when he gets there. In the back of the room, Lieutenant Sarah Chen watched her former mechanic command the attention of colonels and generals with the same quiet authority he'd brought to fixing engines. The transition hadn't been easy for Frank. He still worked part-time in Hangar 7, still preferred the honest simplicity of mechanical problems to the complexities of human psychology. But he'd found something in teaching that he'd lost in flying: purpose without violence, expertise without aggression. He was training pilots to come home alive, not to make sure their enemies didn't. After the briefing, Frank found Sarah in the hallway. "Still struggling with high-altitude stalls?" he asked with a slight smile. "No, sir, but I've got a new problem. My engine's making a weird noise on startup." Frank's smile widened. "Now that's a problem I can solve." As they walked toward the hangar together, Sarah reflected on the strange path that had brought them both here. A simple question about flying techniques had revealed a master aviator hiding in plain sight, a man whose knowledge was too valuable to remain hidden, even if he'd tried. Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who've walked away from what they're teaching. They understand not just the technical aspects, but the human cost of expertise. Frank Morrison had spent decades learning to fly and fight, but his greatest contribution came from learning when to stop. The tattoo on his arm still told the story of 15 different aircraft, dozens of missions, and countless hours in the sky. But now it told a different story, too, of a warrior who'd found a way to serve without fighting, to lead without commanding, to teach without glorifying war. In Hangar 7, the planes still needed fixing, and Frank Morrison, former aggressor pilot, current teacher, perpetual mechanic, was exactly where he needed to be. Welcome to Hidden Heroes. If this story moved you, please share it, subscribe to our channel, and remember, the greatest experts are often the ones working quietly beside us, their knowledge hidden behind modest titles and simple tasks. You just have to know how to look.